Hello, everyone. Today, I'll be talking about the life cycle assessment. Before that, I want to talk about the sustainability. Sustainability is actually a combination of factors of economic, environment, and social. In economic factors, we are focusing on reduction of the cost, increasing the productivity, and optimizing the operating parameters. In environmental assessment, we are focusing in reduction of energy consumption, reduction of input materials consumption, and also waste and emissions. And in social aspects, we are focusing on reduction of the risk involved toward the health, improving the safety and employment. Sustainable development actually requires balancing between environmental, economic, and social factors. During the last seminar, Dr. Tristan Brown talked about the techno-economic analysis, which is actually evaluation of the technical feasibility and cost for the products and processes. Today, I'm going to talk about the environmental impact assessment using life cycle assessment, but economic analysis, environmental assessment, those are not separate aspects. In our studies, usually we present, it's good to present the result from techno-economic analysis and environmental impacts combined together in journal publications or in reports. With that, this is the overview of my slides for today's presentation. I will start talking about the carbon processes and carbon cycle. Then I'll focus on life cycle assessment. I'll provide a brief introduction to this technique, the methodology for doing life cycle assessment, and the data, some of the databases and tools that we are using for life cycle assessment. At the end, I'll provide a case study of using LCA for bioenergy. As you know, the Earth is getting warmer, and we can help turn down the heat by reducing our carbon footprint. But what is carbon? Carbon is actually the fourth most common element in the Earth. Trees are usually around 50% carbon. Forest products are the same. And trees usually consume around 1.83 kg of carbon dioxide through photosynthesis to produce 1 kg of wood or 0.5 kg of carbon. As you see in this graph, plants or trees are uptaking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. Some of that is being released to the environment through respiration. Some is stored in the plant, that we call it plant growth. Some is stored in the root and in the leaf, and then is turning to the ground. In the soil, through microorganisms, is being decomposed and is being released to the environment. This is the carbon cycle. And actually, what we are talking about right now is biogenic carbon. This is the natural carbon cycle in the plants. And as you see, carbon is being stored in the plants, in the trees. Then it goes through different pathways. If there is fire or decomposition, it can be released to the environment immediately. It may go through biomass conversion processes to bioenergy or biofuels in different types, for example, solid biofuel, liquid biofuel, or gaseous biofuel. Then through combustion, it can be released to the environment, or it can be converted to different wood products. For example, for the constructions, it can remain for a long time, and then at the end, it's being released to the environment. This is the carbon cycle, and to sustain the life, carbon is moving around the Earth from the air to the ground to the ocean and again to the air. Carbon is being stored in various spots along this journey. But sometimes we are using fossil carbon, for example, for transportation fuel and other energy sources. Fossil carbon is locked in the ground, and it can be used as in different types, for example, solid, such as coal, natural gas, or crude oil. The difference between fossil carbon and biogenic carbon is that biogenic carbon is a closed cycle, but fossil carbon is one way and is open system. So when it's being released to the environment, it doesn't turn to the origin. And that's why we have higher concentration of carbon in the atmosphere. Right now, carbon dioxide levels rise by 1.9 ppm each year. This is around 36% over the last 150 years. So that was the carbon cycle and carbon flow from fossil fuels, but which can cause global warming or climate change. Global warming is actually one of the impact categories or one of the environmental impacts that we can estimate through life cycle assessment, but it's not the only one. There is a long list of other environmental impacts we can estimate through life cycle assessment. I will present those later in the slides. But life cycle assessment is actually a technique. It can be used for analyzing the environmental impacts and sustainability of products, services through the whole life cycle. LCA refers to the processes of combining, evaluating the inputs, outputs, and emissions through the whole life cycle from cradle to grave. It usually answers two main questions. Those are, what are the environmental impacts of product or process, and how do the environmental impact of different products or processes compare? For doing the LCA, we usually compile the inventory of inputs, products, including the main product, byproduct, waste, and emissions, and then we translate those into environmental impacts. At the end, there is interpretation of the results for the inventory and impact assessment related to the objective of the study. LCA actually has four main steps or stages that are provided by ISO standard. The first step is goal and scope definition. In goal and scope definition, we should identify the intended audience for the study, the proposed application and function for the product, the reason for performing this study, and those they should be specified in goal and scope, in goal of the study. In scope, actually, we identify the functional unit and the reference flow, the system bound. We define a system boundary for this for the study. We identify the geographic location and other factors that I'll describe more details about those later in the slides. The next step is inventory analysis. For doing the LCA, we need to identify the inventory of inputs, different products, waste, and emissions. Those can be provided from operational data, which can come, for example, from a plant, from techno-economic assessment or process modeling, or from the literature. The next step is impact assessment. At this step, we translate the inventory of inputs and output and emissions into the different environmental impacts. Sorry. Then there is interpretation of the results. So for LCA, usually collect the data from different sources. It can come from literature, from lab scale experiments, or from process modeling, or from large scale plant. Sometimes we don't have the actual data. In that case, there is an uncertainty in the results, and we do the uncertainty analysis from using different techniques, and those are not in the scope of my presentation, so I won't talk about those here. Some of the applications of LCA include product development and improvement, strategic planning, public policy making, and marketing. Here I'll present more details about the 4 main steps of conducting LCA. In goal and scope definition, we should identify the intended audience. Then we should identify what is the application or function of the product being studied. For example, if we are doing the LCA for soybean production, we should identify soybean is being used as feed or is being used for as feedstock for bioenergy or biofuel production. What are the reasons for doing the LCA? And sometimes we want to compare different products. For example, these are 3 different products. They can be used for the same purpose, but they are coming from different sources through different pathways. So the environmental impacts associated with each of these products are different. Then we should identify this reference system and the functional unit. These are still in goal and scope definition. Some of the, here we should identify what are we comparing. For example, these are examples of bioenergy related. So are we comparing ethanol versus gasoline? Are we comparing corn ethanol versus silicic ethanol? Or are we comparing 2 different technologies? For example, anaerobic digestion and composting, or for example, fossil fuel or biofuel. Those need to be identified in the goal and scope definition. Other examples are, for example, comparing paper and plastic bags, or ceramic or plastic cups. Geographic location is one of the main factors needs to be identified in goal and scope definition, because it really impacts the results of LCA. There are different sources of variations in LCA results related to geographic location. For example, raw material being used for the same product in different locations would be different. Availability of feedstock is different. Management practices are varying a lot. For example, in soybean production in Ohio, in Iowa, in Brazil, in Europe, they are following different management practices that really impact the results of the LCA. Crop rotation is another factor affecting the LCA results in agricultural products. Yield is another factor. For example, for 1 kg of soybean or canola in Iowa or Ohio or Europe, we are using different amount of inputs. Sometimes in Middle East, for example, they are using a lot of irrigation water. They are using a lot of electricity to pump water, which is not being needed in most of the places in the US. Technology being used in another factor. So this can be related to feedstock production, or for the logistic or conversion processes that impact the overall LCA results. For example, in electricity grid mix is one of the inputs. It can be used for the same technology, but in different locations, the electricity mix is different. This map shows that there is a large variation in share of renewables in electricity generation in different countries. So when we have higher share of renewable energy, for electricity generation, the carbon intensity of electricity is less. And those are really impacting the overall results. This can be even different in different states of the US. The next step is to identify the system boundary for our study. This graph shows the overall life cycle stage of a product. Usually it starts with material extraction. We are using natural resources. Then there is design and production. It can be in different steps. For example, in biodiesel production, we have feedstock production, we have logistics, we have biofuel production. Then there is distribution, use, and maintenance. After that, there is disposal. It can go through reuse for some of the product. It can follow the recycling process, or it can be recovered. So for all those pathways, we should consider the right application. In different steps, we have emissions and waste, which is coming out of the life cycle. And we have energy and material, which is being used. Sometimes we want to focus on just certain processes, for example, hydrogenation of oil to produce biofuel. In this case, we may just focus on the production phase, and we call it gate-to-gate analysis. Sometimes we are using cradle-to-gate. In this case, we are covering the material extraction and the production. For example, production of biodiesel until the biorefinery gate. But sometimes we are covering the whole life cycle stage, that we call it cradle to grave. So these are the system boundaries that we can have for different products. And based on the purpose of the study, we should identify the system boundary. For LCA, we need to do the allocation. Allocation refers to the proportionate assignment of material input and environmental emissions between the main product, the co-product, and byproducts and waste. For example, in this graph, it shows that corn grain is we have fermentation, then there is distillation. After that, we can produce ethanol, but there is a byproduct of DDGS. Since we have two products which is coming out of this system, we need to do allocation. It can be based on mass flow, it can be based on energy value, or it can be based on economic value. So by doing the allocation, actually, we are allocating some of the environmental impacts to the main product and some to the byproduct. The next step in doing LCA is inventory analysis. Here, we quantify the inputs from a study system or inputs from nature, the output, including the main product, the byproduct, the waste, and emissions. And we call this the unit process that we define the input flows and output flows. The unit process is the smallest unit of the system, of the SI system, that we can quantify these flows for that. Inputs usually include energy and material, and the outputs are products, can be electricity, materials, goods or service, waste, emissions, and co-products. This is an example of inventory analysis for feedstock production, for example, for canola production. For doing LCA, we need to estimate the inputs that being used for feedstock production. We have different processes for manufacture of inputs, for example, fertilizer production, pesticide production, manufacture of different equipment, fuel, and seeds. Then those are transported to the field. Here we have some emissions, since it's before application of those inputs in the farm. We call those indirect emissions associated with the production of inputs. At the field, we have some practices, for example, land preparation, seeding, fertilizer or pesticide application, and harvest. Here we are using fuel, and there are some emissions from combustion of diesel fuel, for example, or from fertilizer application in the field. Then there are some logistic operations, for example, handling, drying, storage, and then it can go to the biorefinery. For all these steps, we need to quantify the energy use and material use and the emissions. Here in the farm, when we use fertilizer, usually there is direct emissions in the form of carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane. Those need to be quantified, and usually we use the IPCC guidelines for those estimations. This is an example of inventory analysis for a chemical process. Here, the unit process is, for example, hydrogenation of seed oil, which can, through this unit process, we can produce hydrogenated oil, which is, it can be further used for production of renewable, for example, renewable diesel or renewable jet. Inputs for here are seed oil, hydrogen, catalyst, and energy, and the outputs are hydrogenated oil, waste, and emissions. We need to, when we are focusing on gate-to-gate life cycle assessment, we need to estimate all these inputs and outputs for the unit process. And then after quantifying those, or after inventory analysis, we need to do impact assessment, which is the next step is in LCA. In impact assessment, actually, we are translating the inventory of inputs and emissions into some of the impact categories. For example, one is global warming potential, one can be eutrophication, acidification, or other environmental impacts. Here is an example. We have two processes. Process A emits 12 kg of carbon dioxide, and process B emits 2 kg of methane. When we want to compare these processes, we need to translate these emissions into one unit. And for that, we are doing the impact assessment. There are some factors for conversion. For example, here, this table shows the global warming potential for each of those greenhouse gases. For example, for methane, is 25. That means the global warming potential of 1 kg of methane is equivalent to 25 kg of carbon dioxide. For N2O is around 270. So using these global warming potential factors, we can convert carbon dioxide and methane into carbon dioxide equivalent, which is the unit for global warming impact. And with that, we see that for process A, we have 12 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent, but for process B, we have 50 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent. And we see that process B has higher global warming impact. These are some of the greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, methane, nitrous oxide. And for example, this is an inventory of these gases using global warming potential factors. We can, that are listed here, we can convert all of those into global warming impact in the unit of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then by summing these impacts, you'll see that total GW impact for this process is, for example, 179.1 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent for the defined functional unit. Here's a list of other impact categories. Global warming is just one. You have acidification, eutrophication, ecotoxicity, resources depletion, and land use. And it's even longer than that. What we are talking about is just here, for example, carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is causing climate change, but in midpoint indicator is causing infrared forcing and other damage to the health, to the human health. Phosphorus, for example, it can cause marine and freshwater eutrophication. In midpoint indicator, it can cause algae growth and then damage to the ecosystem. For other types of emissions, we have different midpoint category and indicators that they can be estimated through life cycle assessment. Here is a list of different softwares for doing LCA. Grid Model, OpenLCA, and CIMA-Pro are some of the most common software that we usually use for life cycle assessment. During the impact assessment, we are translating the inventories of input, output into different environmental impacts. For those, we usually use different databases. EcoInvent is one of the most common databases that we can use for this step. In doing LCH, there are some challenges. Some of the most common include complexity in supply chain, which can be difficult to track. Also, accessibility of accurate and current data. Sometimes we want to do life cycle assessment for a process which is not existing. For that, we need to estimate some of the data, or we can use, for example, process modeling and techno-economic analysis, and then identify the inventory for the input, output, and then those will be the input for, those can be used for inventory analysis. Difficulty in predicting the future. So what we are analyzing is the current situation. The technology is changing. So based on that, the emissions, the LCA results will be different in the future. There are some challenges in weighting various metrics. For example, as you saw in the previous slide, we have different impact categories. So for each of those, at the end, it's difficult to decide which process or which product is like better in terms of life cycle assessment, because those are different environmental impacts, and it's difficult to weight those. There is uncertainty in the results usually because data is coming from different sources. But through uncertainty analysis, we can reduce some of those uncertainties. Overall, LCA is an estimating tool. It is used for guidance and not for hard answers. Here, I'll provide a case study of application of LCA in sustainable aviation fuel production. Sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, can be produced from different types of feedstock to different pathways. For example, oil-based feedstock, canola, soybean, camelina. They can be converted to SAF, but we have pretreatment, which is oil extraction, and then we have conversion processes. For example, hydroprocessing technology or HEFA process can be used for conversion of oil into SAF. It can be produced from sugar-based feedstock or starch-based feedstock through biochemical conversion to alcohol to jet or fermentation, or it can be produced from liquid feedstock. Here, it can feedstock can go through sugar extraction and then alcohol to jet conversion or income through gasification feature traps and conversion to sustainable aviation fuel. There are several pathways for production of SAF. And this graph showed the global warming impact of SAF production from different sources. Here, there are some oilseed or oil-based feedstock, and there are some some of the source lignocellulosic biomass here, for example, corn stover, switchgrass, forest residue. So for overall, you can see that for for SAF production from oil-based feedstock, usually we have higher global warming impact than from lignocellulosic biomass. But in almost all of these, the global warming impact is less than fossil jet fuel, which is around 85 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of sustainable aviation fuel. In some cases, for production of SAF from oilseeds, global warming impact is is mostly affected by agricultural phase, for example, use of fertilizer or pesticide during the production of feedstock. And if we go in more details here, here is the graph of GW impact of SAF production from pennycress oilseed. This is the study that we did before. As you see, total GW impact is around 40 gram carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. It's mostly related to fertilization, or we can say the agricultural phase. And this graph shows GW impact of production from forest residue is less than GW impact of oil-based feedstock, because we don't have those inputs, for example, fertilizer, pesticide application during the agricultural phase. And here, most of the impacts are due to the biorefinery phase. And for that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to take any question.
Okay, terrific. Thank you very much, Dr. Musavi Avval. Do we have any questions either online or in the seminar room for him? And as we're thinking and checking this, I'd like to start off by asking, now when we run experiments in the laboratory, we always use what we call a control to assess the actual impact of our experimental treatment. Is there something similar in LCA that is done to model the alternative or business as usual scenarios so that your model results can be more meaningful?
When we are doing the LCA, actually, it's good to have a baseline. And baseline, usually it can be, for example, environmental impacts of fossil fuel in case of biofuel production. We can compare, if we are the purpose is to compare it with fossil fuel, the baseline can be environmental impacts of fossil fuel. For example, here, as you saw, we are comparing environmental impacts of SAF production from different feedstock with fossil jet fuel. So here we have defined the fossil jet fuel as the baseline. But other than that, if we want to compare, for example, environmental impacts or GW impact of SAF production from oil-based feedstock, there are some reports provided by national labs, for example, NREL. They have provided some a range of result for example, GW impact or other impact categories. It can be used for reference, and I think that's it. There are lots of studies going in this area. We can compare those, but in terms of control, I would just say we can use the fossil baselines or some of the results from reports from national labs.
All right, great. So another question that's come up relates to how you mention on slide 24 that LCA is not meant to be used for hard answers, but for guidance. However, it seems that LCA as a methodology is all designed to produce hard numbers as the output. And so what's your advice to us as researchers who are either carrying out LCA or reading and trying to understand LCA? What sense should we make of these hard numbers that are coming out of the LCA methodology if we are not supposed to be using it for hard answers?
So here, what I mean by this, for example, one of the factors, there are lots of factors which affect the result in LCA. For example, one is geographic location. For example, GW impact of self-production from soybean can be different from farm to farm, or based on technology that we are using, those are different. But in doing LCA, sometimes we are using average numbers. For example, the electricity grid, or some, for example, other technologies that we use during the production. And those data are coming from databases. They are like the average numbers, but it can give us an overall estimation of environmental impacts, but it's not like the hard answer that you can. It's not just a like exact number when we say global warming potential of this kind of fuel is this much. Is not like exact number. It can be changing by using different methods. Even as you see here, we have different databases for doing LCA, and sometimes the result from using these different databases, they're different. So there is a variation in the result of LCA, but we can like reduce some of the uncertainties and have an overall estimation when we just want to report the global warming impact of specific product. But when we are comparing different products, that won't matter because we are using, for example, same database, same technology to compare two different pathways or two different products in terms of global warming or other environmental impacts. So in that case, it won't matter. But when we are just reporting a single number for global warming impact of, for example, SAF, it can be different by using different methods, different databases.
Okay, we have a question. They're asking about how does the source of hydrogen affect greenhouse gases of sustainable aviation fuels? Are those sources of hydrogen a major contributor?
Hydrogen is actually one of the main contributors to environmental impacts of SAF production through hydrogenation. We are using a lot of hydrogen, and hydrogen is an energy-intensive input. So it's impacting a lot the overall GW global warming potential of that fuel, but use of hydrogen, for example, from renewable sources or production of hydrogen at the biorefinery. Those are like some of the solutions to reduce the environmental impacts associated with hydrogen. But overall, yes, it's in terms of SAF production, it has high impact in overall GW impact.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Nice
So-
and loud.
So you're talking about converting, I think it was carbon and methane, and kind of comparing the two. Are there other like units that you would have to convert? Like just more would carbon and methane be the only examples of that, or are there other examples of having to convert different units? Compare them.
Yes. For the example that I provided, that is just for is estimating global warming potential associated with some of the greenhouse gases, for example, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, or methane. But the same method can be used for estimating or for translating other inputs into associated environmental impacts. For example, when there is phosphorus emission or phosphorus use in the soil, it can cause eutrophication. There are methodologies provided, for example, by IPCC to estimate some of the direct emissions when we apply, for example, phosphorus fertilizer in the field, how much is being emitted to the environment. And using those IPCC guidelines, we estimate the emissions, and then using the databases, those are being translated to associated environmental impacts. For example, here to eutrophication, or for example, another impact is resources use or fossil resources use that is related to use of fossil fuel, for example, diesel fuel for farm productions or electricity use. So resources use impact is being estimated to is related to those inputs, and those are we are not doing those. Those are actually part of the modeling in software using the database.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we're just about at the close of our allotted time for the seminar. So Dr. Seyed Avval, thank you very much for the time you spent with us today. Really appreciate your sharing your expertise with us. And thank you again to everyone who has attended this, our final Mass Bio seminar of the year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.